I thought I might tell you boys and girls today about Brazoria County's most famous ghost. Now it takes the form of a mysterious light that floats across the prairie and darts up into the tops of the trees and often crosses a busy highway, scaring motorists half to death. Do you all know what story this is?
Bailey's light?
The story of Bailey's light, that's right. Now, this ghost, this light, is generally thought to be the ghost of a man whose name was James Britton Bailey. And he came to Texas in the early days, even before Stephen F. Austin brought his first colonists. This was in 1818 when he came, and he and his family took a boat, one of these small sailing boats at New Orleans, and they came across the Gulf and landed at Galveston. And then they got some wagons and some horses, and they came straight to what was to be Brazoria County and settled on the prairie that still bears the Bailey name. Now, as more and more people began to come into this area, and they settled along the Brazos River, and they established plantations, and they little towns grew up, towns like Velasco and Brazoria, and this town we're in now, which was then called Bell's Landing. People began to talk about this fellow that lived out on the prairie. He was a fine man in lots of ways. He wouldn't bother to tell a lie. He was very truthful. He was brave. He wasn't scared of the devil himself. But he had certain peculiarities. He was, in some ways you might say, eccentric. Do you know what that means? Well, it means he was kind of nuts. You know what that means, don't you? Okay. Well, one of the things that he became known for was his love of fighting. He loved to fight. Now, he had a high temper, but he didn't have to be mad. It was just his favorite indoor and outdoor sport. They say he would ride across the prairie on horseback, probably going to Brazoria, which was the biggest town in those days, and he'd see somebody coming toward him. As soon as the fella got close enough, old Brett would feel like a good workout, you know, and he'd say, "Stop, get down and prepare to fight." Maybe he didn't even know the man. But nobody'd take a day like that, so down the fella would get, and they'd have at it hot and heavy until Britt got tired. Or maybe he, was getting the worst of it. But he had to go into town or something. He'd say, "Fight's over," and sure enough it was. But he would just hit anybody that got in front of him. Could be his best friend. And if, when he got through with that, he would feel like he'd really had what we used to call a ball, a real good time. That was one of the peculiar things about it. Another thing was that he liked to shoot at people's feet and make them dance. I guess people knew pretty well when they went there to the Bailey place that this might happen to him. But he played this trick once on a Methodist preacher who was totally surprised. He didn't know what was going to happen when he went to the Bailey place. The Methodist preacher lived out here at West Columbia, which was called Columbia in those days, and he'd been way up the country preaching. And so he started home one night, and it got late, it got dark, it was cold, he was hungry, he got a late start, you see, and he's still quite a ways from home. So he saw this light out there on the prairie, this one light in this house out there, and he thought, I wonder if those people would let me spend the night and maybe give me something to eat. That was kind of customary in those days. And he thought, well, it won't hurt to ask. So he went up and he knocked on the door. Well, old Britt was sitting there, and he'd been there by himself all afternoon. His wife and his other children had gone to visit a married daughter who lived right down this river out here, down the Brazos River, a few miles. So he was lonesome. Now, I have to admit he'd been hitting the bottle a little bit during the afternoon. Do you know what I mean by hitting the bottle?
Drinking?
Yes. It didn't mean he had a bottle that he hit. It means, Anyway, he had been, but he didn't like drinking by himself, and he just delighted when this knock came on the door. So he went to the door and he flung it open and he said, "Walk in, stranger." Well, the preacher was delighted with that welcome, of course. So he started in, but he hardly got his foot in the room when old Britt says, "But now remember, you have to obey the rules of the house." Well, the preacher didn't know what the rules were, of course, but he figured he could obey any rules anybody had in their own house. And besides that, he didn't want to go back out there and get on that old horse and ride across that cold prairie, So he just sort of nodded his head and walked on in. Well, Britt told him sure he could spend the night, and showed him, had his saddlebags taken into the room next door, where he could, next door to the sitting room where they were sitting, and told him he could spend the night in that room, had something to eat brought, and they sat there talking for quite a while. Every now and then, preacher told Britt he was a preacher, by the way. I see, Britt had never seen him before, he didn't know him. I don't guess Britt had been to church, you reckon? Well, anyway, the preacher did tell him. And every now and then the preacher would wonder, you know, about the rules of the house. But he wasn't going to bring it up unless Mr. Bailey did. So finally, the preacher was pretty tired and sleepy, and he yawned a little bit, and Britt didn't stop talking, and he yawned a little bit more, and finally he got up and he said, Mr. Bailey, I don't know about you, but he said, I'm so tired and I got to get up early in the morning, get on that old horse and ride across that prairie. I'd like to go to bed. And Britt said, but preacher, you haven't obeyed the rules of the house. And the preacher said, well, Mr. Bailey, what do you want me to do? And Britt said, well, I want you to dance. And the preacher said, but Mr. Bailey, I don't know much about dancing. I'm a preacher, you know. I just never did much dancing. And Britt said, well, if that's the way you feel about it, preacher, let's make it more fun. Let you get up on the table and dance. And I got another idea. Pull off all your clothes and get up on the table and dance. Isn't that awful? I don't know why he wanted to do that to you. But anyway, the preacher was horrified. He wasn't about to do that, you know. Didn't think he was about to do it. But old Britt picked up this big old gun. He put a bullet right by the preacher's toe. Well, the preacher was a brave man. Had to be in Texas in those days, preaching. But he didn't want to lose a toe any more than you or I would. So he found out that he could dance, all right? He could get up on the table. He didn't even mind pulling his clothes off under the circumstances, so that's what he did. Well, he wasn't a very good dancer, but he tried, and he was pretty awkward. And every now and then, well, he'd get tired, you know, and he'd slow down or practically stop. But Britt didn't have to shoot at his toe again. All he had to do, pick up the gun and point it at the preacher's foot, and the preacher would get renewed energy and start dancing again. Just flopping around that table, poor old thing. Well, finally Britt got tired of the game, and he said, all right, preacher, you can get in. He said, I guess you did the best you could. Said, you made a mighty poor out at dancing, though. But I don't know what else you could expect of a preacher. Get on down, put your clothes on. So the preacher did. And then Britt got a tad careless. He had this gun, you know, and he laid it down on the bench where he'd been sitting. He went over to put a log of wood on the fire. And when he turned around, the preacher had the gun. Well, the preacher pointed at Britt, and Britt said, put that gun down, preacher, you might hurt somebody. And the preacher said, I sure might, Mr. Bailey, and it might be you, if you don't get up on that table and dance. Well, he's waving that old gun around. Britt didn't look to Britt like the preacher knew much about firearms. Maybe not as much as he did about dancing. He's afraid he might lose a leg, or maybe even worse. So he said, Britt said, okay, and he got up on the table, all he could do, and danced. And he could do it real good. And he danced, and every now and then, though, he'd get mad. And he'd say, look here, preacher, that's enough. And the preacher would say, not nearly enough, Mr. Bailey, not nearly enough. Wave that old gun around, the preacher would start dancing again. Well, finally, the preacher did get tired of the game too, and he said, all right, Mr. Bailey, you can get out. So Britt got down, and the preacher handed him the gun. He said, here, Mr. Bailey, here's your gun. He said, I don't know how mad you are, but I would sure still like to spend the night. I sure would hate to go out there and get on that old horse and ride across that cold prairie. And he said, it's your house, though. If you tell me to leave, of course I'll go. But he said, I danced and you danced, and I think it's all fair and square. So he started toward the door of that room, you know, where I told you he'd put his saddlebags. Hopefully, you know, that Britt would let him still spend the night. When he got to the door, something hit him on the back and knocked him down. Well, he regained his balance, he got on his feet, he whirled around, and of course it was Britt. But instead of being mad, he was dying laughing. It struck him as funny. And he says, You're the first man that ever got the best of old Britt Bailey, and Britt and the preacher were the best of friends from then on out. Now, there are lots more stories about Britt, but we won't go into all of those. I do want to tell you one thing, though, and that is that another thing that he was known for was the amount of booze he could drink and his love of the stuff. There is a story about one night when he went into town to Brazoria, and it was Saturday night, and he was just going to have himself a good time, you know, and he went from saloon to saloon. There wasn't anybody in any of them. There was a big preaching in town, and all the men had gone. The wives probably dragged them, you know, and so there wasn't anybody to drink with to mount anything. So he wasn't having any fun. I think I told you he didn't like to drink by himself. So finally he got his jug filled up, and he went back to his home on the prairie. He sat down under a tree, and he'd take a swig, and he'd say whoopee, try to make out like he's having a good time, you know, but he really wasn't. So he had to do something to liven things up. He's probably pretty, you know, tiddly by that time. So he got up and set fire to the barn. Now, by the time the barn burned down, the jug was empty. And for the moment, he thought he'd had a good time. Of course, the next day, he was sorry as he could be for what he'd done. Now, when Britt died, they built a pine box, which is what they used for coffins in those days, and they placed the body in it, but they hadn't nailed the lid down yet. And the coffin was still in the living room of the house. They were getting ready to have the funeral, and Miss Bailey was standing there beside it when a slave, Britt's favorite slave, whose name was Bubba, came in. Now, Bubba had been given to Britt when Britt was 6 years old, and Bubba was 6 years old. And they had grown up together, and they were more like brothers than master and slave. One thing, though, Bubba always wanted Britt to have everything his heart's desired, everything he wanted, and he did his best to see that Britt got everything he wanted while he was alive. And you can see that he still felt the same way after Britt was dead, because he was carrying something. And Miss Bailey was standing there, and she says, Bubba, what's that you got? And he said, you know what it is, old miss? It's that jug of whiskey he wanted in his coffin. And she said, well, he's not going to have it. And Bubba said, but old miss, he be powerful mad. He said why I need it when he crossed the dark river. And she said, well, I don't care if he'll be mad or not. He's not going to have it, she said. He had enough of that stuff on this earth, and he's not taking any of it with him no matter where he's going. And with that, she took the jug and she threw it out the window. They dug a great big hole out in the pecan grove near the house. It was great big, about as big around as an old-fashioned wash tub, and it was 8 feet deep, so that they could lower the coffin straight down in it, you see. He left instructions in his will that he be buried standing up and facing west. He said that he didn't want anybody to pass his grave and say, there lies old Britt Bailey. And as long as he's standing up, you see, he didn't figure they could say that, you understand? He wanted to be going west, facing west, because he'd been going west all of his life, and he still wanted to be going west when he crossed the Great Divide. Then, that's all that's in the will, that business about how he wanted to be buried. But legend has added a whole lot to the things that he wanted in that coffin. Among these, some people said, one story goes, that he wanted a gun over his shoulder and his powder horn strapped on and at the ready, is the way it was expressed, which I suppose means he wanted the powder horn open so he could get to his powder easily. Now that story was told to me by one of the old niggers at Bailey's Prairie when I was a little girl. And he always ended up that story by saying, and that's why old Moss Bailey, he don't stand easy in his grave. He's still out looking for that jug of whiskey. Well, that may be the reason. I don't know. It's the only one I've ever heard, and I guess it's as good a reason as any. Because since I was just a child on Bailey's Prairie, it's been a well-established fact that Britt Bailey does haunt the prairie in the shape of a light. Now, some say it's a lantern, that he's hunting for his jug of whiskey. Others describe it so differently that it could not be a lantern. The first time that I ever heard of it being seen was way back in about 1850. In the middle 1850s, way over 100 years ago. Colonel Medella Munson, who was my great uncle, lived on the prairie. And he and a friend was sitting in the living room of their house one night when, they were talking about the crops, one thing and another. It was a miserable night. It was in the fall of the year. It was drizzling rain, dark as pitch outside. All of a sudden, the dogs began to bark. Well, he and his friend got up to go out and see what was the matter with the dogs. And they got out on the porch. They called it the gallery in those days. It ran clear across the front of the house. And they saw what was, but by the time they got out there, the whole outside world was lighted up. Now the dogs had come around to the front, and they were down on their bellies, and they were whining. That's what dogs do when there's ghosts around. Did you all know that? Mm-hmm. Well, if you see a dog down on his belly whining, you can be sure there's a ghost around somewhere. Unless, of course, the dog has fleas or worms or something, which might be, you know. But anyway, that's what these dogs were doing. And right across the prairie, in the edge of the trees, they saw this light. Well, actually, it seemed to be there was a little copse of trees there, a little island of trees, they called it, and it seemed to be right in front of those trees. It appeared to be about 4 miles away, but it was so bright that it lighted up the whole prairie. And you could have sat down on the steps of that plantation house and read the newspaper by its light, believe it or not. Well, the men got on the horses and they rolled across to see what this thing was. I guess nowadays we'd think the atom bomb had been dropped or something, wouldn't we? But they had no idea what it could be. And they got within about half a block of it, and suddenly it went out. Well, the night was so dark they couldn't see their hands in front of their faces, and they turned their horses and started to go back. But just as they did, the light appeared again, this time about 2 miles away. So they spurred their horses and they went after it again. They never could get any closer to it. They chased it all night. They would get within about the same distance that they did the first time it would go out. Finally, toward morning, the light darted suddenly over to the side of the prairie. Now, there was a great big oak tree that stood there all by itself, one they knew well. And the light stopped for a minute as if caught in the branches, and then went up to the sky in a sheet of flame and disappeared. Well, they waited around for a little while, you know, but then they realized that the show was over for the night, so they went back to the plantation house. But the next morning, they got up, they got on their horses, and they rode across the prairie. The drizzle had cleared away. It was a beautiful sunshiny day. They went over to that tree and they examined it. They even climbed up in it. They couldn't see anywhere where any fire had been near it, even though they'd seen it enveloped in flames just a few hours before. Now, who decided that was Bailey's light? I don't know. That's lost in the myths of legend. But in the late 1930s, two of my brothers, my brother Bobby and my brother Joe, were sitting in the living room of our house on Bailey's Prairie, and this was a dark and chilly night with more than a hint of the coming winter in the air. It was along in November, you see. And they had a fire going, and they were sitting there talking. My father had gone to bed. Well, all of a sudden, the dogs began to bark. So they ran out on the front porch. The dogs had come around to the front. My father called and told them and said, "Go see what's the matter with those dogs." So they started out. The dogs had come around to the front, so they went out on the front porch, and they saw what was making the commotion. You know what the dogs were doing, don't you?
Whining.
They were down on their stomachs whining, right. And across the way, along the edge of the prairie, there was a studded kind of line of oak trees. There was a low place there where the wild iris always bloomed in the spring. And here they saw this light moving along about as far off the ground as the back of a horse. Now, my brother Bobby described it this way. He said it was bright orange in color, and it looked to be flaming. It was about the size of a basketball. He said it looked like a torch, except it was not torch-shaped, you see. It was round. And it was moving along, so they followed it. And the road in front of our house runs parallel to the highway. And when it gets down to where you can see that big tin barn out there, if you go out there, it turns and goes out to the highway. Well, the light looked as if it knew where it was going. When it got to the place where the road turns, it took the middle of the road. And my brother Bobby always said that night was so still, the only thing he could hear was my brother Joe's heart beating. But when that light got to that fence, it went through the gate, where the gate was fastened, and they distinctly heard that chain rattle. as if something had touched it. Rattle, rattle, rattle. Then the light went on out to the middle of the highway, and a man coming from Angleton got there at the same time. He was going toward West Columbia. He slammed on his brakes. The car slewed around like this, almost turned over, and he whipped it back, and he took off for West Columbia, and my brother Bobby said he was going 90 miles an hour. I said, look here, Bobby, I believe everything you've said but that. I said, cars would not go that fast back then. If they did 50, they were doing good. And he said, maybe so, but he said, it looked like he was doing 90 to me. He said, maybe he got out and pushed it. He was so scared. Well, that's the time that they saw it, and there's several other people who have seen it down through the years, many, many times, and have told me stories about having seen it. A man and his wife were coming back from El Campo one night, going to Texas City, and they came along across Bailey's Prairie on Highway 35, and they saw this light in front of them. The lady described it as being big and round and red and looking like the full moon when it first comes up. You've seen it? Dark red? Looks big, doesn't it? Okay, she asked her husband, she said, what's that? And he said, well, I don't know what it is. And she said, well, is it the moon? And he said, the moon? That's a funny place for the moon to be. And anyway, it's raining. And she said, well, stop. They were almost up to it then. So he slammed on the brakes, and the light went up over the top of the car, and they jumped out and watched it. It came back down again, and it floated off down the highway and disappeared into the trees by the side of the road. But she wanted to report that to the sheriff's office in Angleton. She thought it should be reported. But he wouldn't let her. He said, those people will think we either drunk or crazy. So they didn't stop. Another friend of mine thinks that Bailey's light can do other things besides, up to other mischief, besides just showing himself and scaring people to death. There's a light. She tells a story about one day when she was going from Angleton to West Columbia, beautiful sunshiny day, around noon. She came to the prairie, and all of a sudden her windshield wipers began to work. No reason to have them on, she hadn't touched them. And they went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Well, she fiddled with this knob, and they went off for a second, then they started up again, back and forth. Well, you know what kind of noise a windshield wiper makes on a dry windshield, if you've ever heard it. Squeak, 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 squeak. Well, finally, she just blew her cool. She got mad. And this is what she told me she did. She hit the steering wheel. And she said, Mr. Bailey, get off of the hood of my car and leave my windshield wipers alone. And with that, the windshield wipers went plop. And she didn't have any more trouble with them. She took her car to the mechanic. And the mechanic says, hey, there's not a thing wrong with your windshield wipers. They're working perfectly. So she told me to tell you young people when I talk to you, and some of the older people might profit by this too, that if Brett Bailey ever bothers you, if he ever gets in your hair, if he ever torments you in any way, just be firm with him. Tell him to buzz off, and he'll leave you alone. Okay? Don't forget that now. I want to tell you something else, one or two other things. One of them is about a friend of mine who was coming back from West Columbia to Angleton with her husband just at dusk. What at Bailey's Prairie we always call that first dark, you know what I mean? Well, they were driving along, and she looked over to her right, and just past that big tin barn out there I told you about, and she saw this light, and she said to her husband, Henry, what's that over there? And he said, well, I guess it's a house. And she said, well, there wasn't any house over there this afternoon. And he said, well, maybe it's a car. And she said, that's not a car, and it's coming toward us. There's no road over there. She said, pull over and stop. So he pulled over on the shoulder and stopped. And here this line came across the prairie about 2 feet above the grass. And she described it when it got close enough so she could see it, as being bright orange in color and about the size of a basketball, just as my brother Bobby had. When it got to the fence, you know what those fences are made out of out there?
Barbed wire.
Barbed wire, right. When you'd think a light would go right through it, wouldn't you? Mm-hmm. It didn't. When it got to the barbed wire fence, it went up and over the top and down again. It went on across the highway, just almost brushed their bumper. When it got to the other side, it treated that fence the same way. up over the top strand and down again. And then it went off into the trees. Well, as I was saying, it had been 4 years this December since anybody has told me about seeing Bailey's light, and I'm a little concerned about it. I'm a little afraid that he's gone for good, and I have not yet gotten to see him. But now, you just wait a minute, I'll tell you. That night, on December the 13th, be 4 years ago, it would be 1981, wouldn't it? 1980. A deputy sheriff was making his rounds, and he came along Highway 35 out that Bailey's Prairie, and he saw something he couldn't understand. And so he called into the radio. He pulled over and stopped, and he radioed into the dispatcher at the sheriff's office, and he told her, she was a lady, that there was something out there he didn't like the looks of, and he had no idea what it was, but that he wanted a backup car. He said, you may think I'm a coward, but I don't understand this thing, and I'm going to stay with it, but send somebody else out here. And she said, well, what does it look like? What's going on out at the prairie? And he said, well, it's a big red light, and it's coming at me across the prairie. He said, it's a good ways off, it's not coming very fast, but get somebody out here. So it happened that his buddy, his closest friend, was standing there just getting ready to go off duty, and he said, I'll go. So he ran down, got in his car, and took off for Bailey's Prairie. When he got there, he saw his buddy's car, but he didn't see any light, and he didn't even see his buddy. Well, he jumped out of the car and he ran over to it, and he stuck his head in the window, and the first thing he noticed was a strong smell of gunpowder, as if a gun had gone off in the car. And then he saw his buddy's gun, which was lying down here on the seat, not in the holster where it belonged. And then he saw his buddy. His buddy was all hunkered down, clear down in the bottom of the car, just squunched down, you know what I mean? So he reached in, he thought he was dead. He just looked awful. He reached in, he took him by the shoulder, and he shook it, and he said, buddy, are you all right? What's happened? Are you all right? So the man pulled himself up, you know, until he sat upright in the car, and then he felt himself kind of all over, and he said, well, I guess I'm all right. But he said, that thing kept coming at me, and it got to going faster and faster, and nobody came. Of course, they got there as quick as they could, but I guess it seemed like a long time to him with that light coming at him. And he said, it was just about to come in the window of the car, and I shot it 3 times, and it disappeared. Now, you ought to listen to that very carefully, I can tell, and I want your opinion. Do you think you could scare a ghost off or do a ghost? You couldn't kill a ghost, could you? Like she?
No.
It's already dead. Well, now, one kid told me, one boy, that you could do away with a ghost, let's put it that way, if you had a silver bullet. Did you ever hear that? Well, I'm not worried about that, though, because I don't believe the Brazoria County deputies are provided with silver bullets. Do you? Not with silver costing what it does, anyway. Well, that, as I said, is the last time that I know of that Red Bailey has been seen.